All right, let's get started. Welcome. I guess it feels like after the double AS, it feels like the year is actually starting, even though some of us were actually working here last week. Today, for the AstroAI lunch talk, it's my pleasure to introduce Kshitij Duraphe, who is from UniverseTBD. Kshitij is actually our neighbor working currently for a company in Somerville, but not necessarily rejecting the idea of coming back to work in academia. He's going to be telling us about a really interesting project. I heard about this several times because he's working with Mike Smith, who's an AstroAI fellow here. But I saw a version of this talk at the New York conference last month in San Diego. He's going to be telling us, by the way, he got a master's degree at the engineering, electrical and computer engineering at Boston University, working on the space physics lab. And today he's going to be telling us about the Platonic Universe. You are welcome to imagine what Platonic could mean in this context, but it's more related to philosophy than anything else. And about how converging representations for different modalities of data, provided that you have enough data and a large enough neural network, sort of converge to the same sort of representation without you having to do much more additional work. So, Kshitij, the floor is yours. I encourage everyone to please interact with questions and interact with the speaker if not you want. And yes, and I should have been using my mic, but I'll have a mic here.
Sign up.
Oh, yes, and sign up. Anyway, sign up your attendance here, please, because we need it for funding. Thank you. I'll take it.
Hello.
I don't know how to do that.
Is the mic working? It is, right?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Hopefully, the people on Zoom can also hear.
Do you know how to
I'm trying to turn these lights off or down so that we see the screen better. Sorry.
These mics are out of battery.
Please.
Perfect.
Okay. Is that too dark?
No, that's good.
That's fine.
Hey, hi everyone. Thanks for being here. My talk is titled "The Platonic Universe: Do Foundation Models See the Same Sky?" So as you can see by the author list, this is a collaboration that's been going on between people from all over the world. And this talk is going to be a little bit philosophical, a little bit pure machine learning, and then a little bit astro. So it's a mix of a few things. So this is how the talk's going to be structured. I'm going to give people here an introduction to what is known as the Platonic Representation Hypothesis. Then I'm going to move into our work, which is on the Platonic Universe. And then the extension of it. So this is a talk on work that has not completely finished yet. We're still doing some more things. And I'm going to talk about some interesting results that we've discovered that may be of use to at least a few people I know working here. So what is the background here? The background is that AI is becoming more and more general purpose. There are a lot of AI systems that are being built off the back of general purpose backbones. So, for example, you must have seen hundreds of products that are wrapped around Gemini or GPT or open source models like K2 Think or Lava. And to be perfectly honest, they're becoming homogeneous in terms of not just their architecture, but also their capabilities. One example is that if you go to, for example, ChatGPT for an answer to a question and you go to Gemini, you will get more or less the same response. But there are some specific examples here. So at the bottom left, this is actually some upcoming footage from Gemini drones, which is a system that is using the Gemini Foundation model to do tasks that you would normally expect of computer vision. And not to be outdone, there are companies on the right, you can kind of see a diagram, which are using ChatGPT as an interface to control robots, which is also really interesting. So a natural question to ask is, do these AI models learn similar internal representations? Because their performance is more or less the same. So a natural question to ask is that, do different models represent different data points in similar ways internally? And does it depend on their architecture, training objective, and data modalities? Now, some people from MIT in 2024, specifically Philip Isola, introduced what they call the Platonic Representation Hypothesis, where they investigated this. That hypothesis is specifically that neural networks trained with different objectives on different data and modalities are converting to a shared statistical model of reality in their representation spaces. And I'm going to get into how you can formally model and test this hypothesis, but I just want to say, because I'm going to be mentioning Platonic so much, I should really say that Plato is probably a co-author of this work, because the inspiration really for this entire line of study comes from his allegory of the cave, which is a thought experiment he conducted where he imagined the person chained to the wall of a cave for their entire lives, unable to see outside and only seeing shadows. And then he thought about what they would interpret as reality. Anyway, this is what the PRH setup is. The intuition is that there exists a real world, let's denote that by Z, and your models never observe Z directly. You only observe Z through its measurements. So what are those measurements? They can be things like images, text, sensors that touch things. You have different data modalities in general. And the aim of a lot of your representation learning algorithms is to build embeddings that explain these observations. Now, as your models scale, that is, as you have more data points, more tasks, more modalities, your representations must capture more information about the world. And the hypothesis is that, well, if they're supposed to do everything at once, then their representations must align towards a common structure. And if so, how do you measure this alignment? Well, I just want to say that there are a lot of ways you can represent knowledge about the world, but in this specific case, we're only focusing on vector embedding, so not knowledge graphs or spiking representations or any other ways you can represent knowledge. And with these embeddings, you can characterize them by the similarity structure they induce, which are also known as kernels. And then you define alignment as the similarity between kernels of different modalities, of different models, my bad. So on the right here, you can see the diagram from the PRH paper, where they have Z, which is a red sphere next to a blue cone, and they take an image of that and they pass it through an image model on the bottom left. And on the right, they actually write down the words, the red sphere next to a blue cone, and pass it through a text model. So what are we really going to do when we do a measurement for PRH? You compute. So what we're going to do is you're going to compute embedding matrices, compute their similarity structures across models, and your hypothesis is that as your models grow larger, you're going to get more similar representations. Now, this is one of the main results from the original PRH paper. There's a lot to take in here, but I'm going to explain this. What they do here in PRH is compare vision models and text models for a couple of reasons. One is that there are a lot of vision and text models that you can test, and they've been trained on such massive data sets that it's a pretty straightforward experiment to conduct. Now, the specific metric they use is called the mutual k-nearest neighbors, or MKNN, and we'll get more into that as the talk progresses. But what I want you to really observe here is that on the y-axis, there are a bunch of image models. There's one image model they're comparing the two, and each point on the x-axis compares a specific language model that was used to compare, that was compared with the image model. So as you can see, certain families of models are really quite similar in their alignment to, for example, Dino V2. But the overall trend that you can look at, especially if you look at the top right, is that as your language models grow really big, especially, for example, with the large llama models with 65 billion parameters, their alignment increases. Now, the actual values of this MK and N score, which is on the left, they're quite small, but it is an interesting trend. And this appears to hold regardless of what image model you compare it to, because there's also results for mass data encoders, CLIP, then some models trained on ImageNet, and we see the same trend. So why is this why are they converging? So in the paper, they posit 3 hypotheses. First one is that training imposes increasing constraints. So what that means is every data point, every training objective, and every additional architecture, or every additional block that you add in the architecture, all of them add a constraint as to what this, all of them add a constraint to the learning task. And your representations must satisfy all of these constraints simultaneously and achieve good task performance. And as data, tasks, and objectives all scale, the set of valid representations shrinks. The second hypothesis is what they call the capacity hypothesis, and which basically says that if there exists a globally optimal representation for a specific task, larger models and improved optimization algorithms better approximate it. And scaling is one way to align towards this shared representation. And the third hypothesis is that as your model grows larger, it will find simpler and simpler solutions to the same task. Now, in principle, over-parameterized networks can have more solutions, but it has been empirically observed since the 1960s that larger models do actually tend to converge to simpler solutions. One question you can ask, for example, is what are these representations converging to? Because so far I've been a little flaky about what exactly this convergence means. So before that, there are a few assumptions that you're making. First assumption is that your world model is really idealized. So what that means is you model the world as there exists some underlying sequence of events that are drawn from your world Z, and your models are never really observing Z directly. And the second assumption is that your observations, so the actual task of taking a photo or writing down something, these are deterministic and bijective measurements. And different modalities are just alternative views of the same events. And if you know P of Z, which is what your world is drawn from, that's a distribution over everything really, then that corresponds to knowing a world model. Under this framework, some contrastive learner, so it can be theoretically derived that some contrastive learners do actually have a way to get somewhat close to P of Z. Specifically, what they do is they learn a representation which satisfies the condition that your similarity between two models is equal to the point-wise mutual information between all data points. But that's only for one family of contrastive learners, not for all, because so that's the only one that's, as far as I know, that has been theoretically derived. But in the real world, none of this is really the case. Your observation functions are stochastic, they're lossy, and your embeddings probably don't fully capture the underlying world. And not all representations may necessarily converge. And of course, there are multiple ways to measure alignment beyond the MKN. So really, the purpose of this talk is to explore how representation convergence behaves.
Can I interrupt with that question?
Yeah.
So this slide pretty much sort of makes the case, the way I see it, that some level of contrastive learning or some sort of forced alignment will always be necessary because of these imperfections of the actual observations. Would you say that that's actually the case, or can we live without, in a world where we don't need to do anything else, the representations coming from different modalities, for them to be, aligned at a level that is actually scientifically useful?
Later in the talk, I addressed this specific question.
Okay.
Because there are some surprising results, actually.
All right.
So in the real world, where you have lossy measurements, you're not really sure if you can really idealize this, or you can get this idealized world model where your measurements are deterministic and bijective. That was kind of the question we set out to explore on astrodata, and therefore the Platonic universe. So why do we want to test the PRH in astronomy? Well, there are a couple of reasons. One is that you have different projections of the same reality. So you have images, spectra, photometric data, which all emerge from the same stellar populations, gas and dust dynamics, and dark matter distributions. But another important thing is that recently people have actually undertaken and successfully completed the task to release giant data sets, as well as make a large variety of foundation models available. And therefore, this task is really tractable. And our research question specifically is that do astro and non-astro foundation models converge to a shared representation as they scale? Does it depend on your architecture? And does it depend on your training objective? So before I get into the actual experiments, this is the data set we're using in 2024. The Multimodal Universe, or MMU, collaboration came out, which took data from a bunch of surveys and a bunch of different instruments. Specific ones we're using the bottom more in this MMU collaboration. And they also provided an easy way to get cross-match data. So for example, you can get an HSC and a JWST image of the same galaxy. And you can also get specters of that fairly quickly. So based on this, we have about 100,000 cross-match observations. And recently, we also have about 160 text galaxy pairs descriptions from a data set that we've inelegantly called the UTBD gal text. And that data set was made mostly towards, mostly because there is some work going on where they want to test language in astro models. But essentially we have a lot of text galaxy pairs, and which is important when further on in the talk. So let's start off with unimodal models. We have 6 specific models that we tested. 4 of these models are general purpose models. They're the VIT, the ConvNext, Dino, and IJEPA. All of them are available at different sizes, and those sizes aren't the same. By sizes, I mean the number of parameters. Their training regimes are different, and their training data is different, and their architecture is different. So each of them has some unique combination of this. And we also have 2 astronomical foundation models. So there's AstroPT. So Mike, who's not here, unfortunately, he's the author of AstroPT. And we also have SpecFormer, which is from the somewhat controversial AstroClip paper that was released. So we have models that are pre-trained on natural data. So we're guaranteed that, whatever natural means, but we're guaranteed that they've never seen astronomical data. And then we have models that are trained on astronomical data, which have not seen natural image data. And we want to measure the representational alignment. So we use this specific metric called MKNN, or the mutual k-nearest neighbors. We can define it as the average amount of common neighbors per object in the embedding spaces. So if you use, for example, if you take an object and you take one modality of it, so for example, if you take an image of an object and you pass it through an image model, get its embedding matrix, and you find its k-nearest neighbors, and then you take a textual representation of that object, do the same for a text model, get its k-nearest neighbors, you want to find out how many of those neighbors are the same in both embedding spaces. And if you have a higher average score, you say that there's more alignment. So we conduct 2 tests, which are the cross-modal test and the intramodal test. Cross-modal uses the same model, but different data modalities. An intermodal uses the same data but different model sizes. And in case they're not, yeah.
How do you choose K? Because I could imagine a representation that in the text is very similar, but then, you have little differences and it would make sense to have when the amount of neighbors decay or some, how do you?
So for our experiments, we went with what the PRH did, the original paper where they chose K equal to 10. There's no real good answer to this. Of course, you're right that's not, if you just increase K to ludicrous amounts, then we can sort of game this score. But the idea is that your MKNN should provide some sort of decent measurement of the local embedding space. But there's no like hard justification for this. We were just following what the PRH did. And in case you're still a little confused about how you measure MKNN, oh, here's a diagram I think that'll make it much more clear. So here I took my object, which is a brick, took an image of it, got the embedding matrix for its image, and we got the embedding matrix for the text. And your MKNN score for this specific computation would be 0.5 because two columns are common. There is a little bit of nuance to this. So a couple things that that may not be immediately obvious is that you have to guarantee that the way you construct these embedding matrices is the same order which you pass the data in, which is not guaranteed, by the way. And the second thing is that this actual embedding space that you create or you visualize with any technique you want, like PCA or UMAP or things like that, that actual visualization and therefore the structure actually changes if you break this alignment that the columns at the same index in both matrices represent the same object. So essentially you're shuffling the embedding space if you shuffle one of the matrices and this alignment breaks. Yes?
I guess I'm gonna say something. Aren't you implicitly assuming that the number of things in each of those two embedding spaces is the same? Because if there were 1,000 more in one of them, it just completely dilutes the overlap, right?
So we actually are guaranteed this because of the MMU dataset. It has the ability to pull the same number of observations between two instruments. Okay. So this is our result. Now there are a lot of colors here, so let's go through this step by step. First thing you want to see is that the graph at the bottom, the middle, which is the random noise baseline, is the graph that you get when you shuffle one of the matrices and compute this MKNN. What we observe, if you look at the actual values, is that your MKNN score is around 0.04 or 0.05%. So all of these are reported as percentages. Which means that to some extent there is some sense in doing this computation because you've shown that shuffling one of the matrices does break this alignment. Now, as for the other four plots, all of the data sets are compared to the HSC. So we use the HSC observations as a baseline, and then you have cross-matched images or spectra from for example, JWST or Legacy or DESI or SDSS. And what's interesting is that, well, there's a couple of things going on. So one is that often you don't have a large amount of foundation models of the same architecture because we're kind of limited by what other people choose to release. So I already know that some people are going to ask, how can you say that there's a trend that emerges if you only have a few points? But nonetheless, you can see that for every architecture, so AstroPT, Convex, Dino, BIT, and IJEPA, the MKNN eventually tends to go up. It's not perfect, sometimes it does go down, but eventually it starts going up a little. And this is this happens when your models get larger, regardless of how they were trained or what data they'd seen. And one other thing I want to point out is that this seems more or less dependent on the data set because the MKNN values are, barring a few exceptions, more or less clustered around the same range. Now, the other test that we did is that if you do this computation between models of the same family but different data sizes or different parameter sizes, you observe this same MKNN trend, except the actual numbers are much higher. And this is probably related to how they're storing this representation internally. So this does tend to support convergence towards a shared representation, although there's no real way to say what that is yet because the actual numbers are so low.
Sorry, can you say, I didn't get that. Can you say again what you're showing here?
So these plots are generated when you pass you pass for example, an HSC image through an image model, and then a JWST image through an image model, and you compute the MKNN. So in that case, you're using the same model. Over here, you have the same data point, but two different models. So we do this MKNN computation two ways. And what we're doing here is that, or what we see here is that we do eventually get the PRH trend. But of course, caveat is that there's only a few there are only a few data points here. So it may be too early to call this a trend. But what is interesting is that your natural image models are tending to align with astronomical models, even though they've never seen the other's data before. For example, ConvNext and SpecFormer are still showing this increase in MKNN with scale, which does.
Is it actually the case that if they have not seen astronomical data, is astronomical data not part of what they have seen during training?
For ConvNext, no. In ImageNet, there is no. And then SpecFormer was trained on Desi spectra. So they do show increasing alignment with scale, which does suggest some universal structural patterns transcending training domains. So the conclusion is that foundation models do see the same sky, is what I would say if this was a month ago. Now comes the interesting part. So far, I've shown you results that you may not be fully convinced by them, but these are all unimodal models. So for example, ConvNext and SpecFormer, sure, different architectures and data, but they're still image modalities. And I've only shown you one comparison. So that's the global structure. So that's the MKNN, which is something about it tells you something about the local structure. And I've shown you some model families, but here's something interesting that we found almost immediately after NeurIPS, is that not all vision models actually converge. So now all the plots that I'll show you are either on the HSC JWST cross-match dataset or on the text dataset, text galaxy comparison. So what we immediately observed is that there are some foundation image models such as SAM, HERA, or VJEPA, which is a video model, in fact, that actually don't reproduce this trend. And we don't quite know why. The hypothesis is that these specific models are trained for dense localized tasks. So they might not actually prioritize this Platonic form that is required for cross-modal alignment. And in some sense, your training objective does tend to matter. So this is the largest difference that we've observed in MKNN so far. This is again on the HSC JWST cross-match dataset. And the image model we were using here was the masked autoencoder with the VIT base. It shows much smaller MKNN compared to JEPA, but this might be because the masked autoencoders are trained to reconstruct missing pixels. So it might be some effect of learning focusing on high frequency noise in the data. But what is more concerning, and this brings us to Rafet's question, is that we observe the complete opposite trend when you use multimodal models, especially things like CLIP or small VLM, which are trained with contrastive loss. Now, there is a bit of nuance to this as well. It also depends on where you're extracting the embeddings from. So we've observed this same trend, whether we extract, for example, at the end layer of this SIGLIP plus small VLM model, or at the junction layer, where just right before all of the models combine, before the image and the text models combine. And then CLIP on its own also seems to stagnate a little, but we're not really quite sure what to do about that. But what really is concerning is this behavior with SIGLIP and small VLM.
So what is it that is decreasing here? The alignment?
The MKNN alignment between GWST and HSC.
So this is not alignment of the modalities that have been trained on the contrastive loss.
Well, SIGLIP has both image and text, so we have to use the image part of it. So,
Okay, so you train on aligning the contrastive part is trained on aligning text
Yeah.
with images,
Mhm.
and then you take the representations from images only
Yeah,
from two different, and you try to see if they align.
Yeah.
They don't. As you grow the model, they don't necessarily
Yeah.
increase the alignment.
But there is a caveat to that as well, which is in the next slide. Is that, yeah?
Yeah, so bigger models take longer to train, right?
Mhm.
And are you sure these are just as converged, or doesn't it matter here, especially here, whether your K is large enough? Because if not, you're poking very local structure rather
Mhm.
than same representation. It could be the same representation, but just, the
Mhm.
10 that you're picking
Yeah.
up, there could be same, if you take 20, they could be the same, they're just a little bit warped, right? It's very local.
So we actually got this result for different values of K. And this actually, your question is also somewhat addressed when we look at the global structure as well. So we'll get to that as well. So right now I've shown you that SIGLIP and small VLM and CLIP in general, contrastively trained models, don't seem to follow this trend. But then we see this trend again if you use PalyGamma. So PalyGamma also uses the SIGLIP vision tower and a linear projector, and it uses a gamma decoder. So this is a foundation model from Google. And in this specific case, what we observed is that if you only use the vision part of PalyGamma, which is guaranteed to not have been contrastively trained, you get the MKNN trend again. That as your model grows bigger, the alignment increases. So something is going on when you take your measurements after this vision and text alignment layer has done its work. So that's kind of interesting. But at this point, one problem is that all of these are MKNN measurements. So these are, like Cecilia said, local measurements. So we do need a global metric. And for that, we chose to go with the fairly standard word as central kernel alignment, which is essentially a measure of how similar the covariances of your embedding matrices are. And it's invariant to orthogonal rotation and isotropic scaling. So the good thing is that you can use it to compare matrices of different sizes and different lengths, or at different sizes. And what we observed here is that now you're measuring the global structure in some sense. What we observed is that for small VLM, the central kernel alignment, as the model size grows larger, decreases and then has a slight jump. For SAM, it increases. For HERA, keep in mind these are image foundation models, it increases. But then some families of image and text models, which already showed this decrease in MKNN, also show a decrease in CKA. So their global structures are also different. And there are a few possible mechanisms for this. So one is that there might be signal dilution in giant models, which basically means that at the end, a lot of these models do mean pooling to aggregate your tokens. So somewhere your Platonic signal is being lost, which probably says that you probably have to use some adaptive pooling strategy to see if the Platonic signal really exists. The other thing is that your vision and text alignment models they show scores that are orders of magnitude lower than vision. So something means that, so we know that contrastive training forces local neighbors to sort of align, but your language anchoring really warps the local manifold to fit your semantic constraints. So your global geometries are orthogonal. And keep this in mind because this is kind of important. But what are the implications for the PRH? So a high CK suggests, for example, that different instruments capture isomorphic projections of the same physical, there's no better word for this, density field. But your global topology in image to text or vision and text models captures semantic space that's fundamentally different from the physical space. So it's going against the PRH. But the interesting thing is that do we expect this behavior? So there has been a paper that came out in May of last year, so it's pretty recent, is that yes, we do actually expect this exact behavior from some clip models, because this is an image, or this is a figure that shows the actual embedding space of clip. Your images and texture are so disjoint that you can draw a linear decision boundary between them. In fact, in higher dimensions, they look like ellipsoids. So we do sort of expect this result. And what do we do about it? Well, that's a work in progress. But now the final thing is that, sure, all of this stuff that we've done could have been done for any sort of cross-match data. It didn't just have to be astro data. But our problem here is that your representational alignment does not really imply your physical correctness. Even the original PRH paper said that your lossy projections may not fully capture the underlying state. So in simple terms, we don't really expect the image of a galaxy to capture all of the physics in it. But what we can do, and I know that this is something quite a few, actually, I'm not sure exactly how many, but some people here do, is that we aim to determine if the neighbors that are identified in the embedding space correspond to neighbors in the physical parameter space. So this kind of allows us to validate whether your learned manifold respects governing physical laws. But think about that as if I was saying it in quotes, because this is still very much a work in progress. So what is our experimental setup for this? We used the convnext family because it showed the best scaling, and we used HSC imagery cross-match with physical catalogs, and we query the embedding space for the nearest neighbors. Again, we're using 10, excuse me, and we measure these three physical parameters as well as the magnitude. And we want to compute the Earth mover's distance, which is the distance between the distribution of physical parameters of the prairie galaxy and that of its retrieved neighbors. And the way to interpret this is that if your Earth mover's distance is lower, then your local distributions are more aligned. And before that, we can also verify that, or we can also sort of test if the representations actually encode physical information. So this comes from some of the mechanistic interpretability work that Anthropic, I think, more or less pioneered. But the idea is to train simple regressors on the frozen features to predict physical parameters. Excuse me, I need this some water. Consequence of having been sick all winter. And this is what we observe, the figures on the next slide, because it's a bit too wide, is that your photometric Z observation, it exhibits strict monotonic scaling, and your mass and star formation rate generally improves with scale. And so basically, simple terms, larger models tend to extract more robust physical features. And this is what it looks like. Again, this is all compared with HSC, and we have the physical parameters from HSC. And eventually, and as your convex models grow larger, their ridge regression performance increases. So and then for the actual Earth movers distance, what we observed is that there's a monotonic decrease in models in this Earth movers distance as your model scale increases, which now comes the really interesting part, is that your model, having never seen any of this astro data before, is to some extent spontaneously organizing the manifold by either physical laws or ways that correspond to physical parameters that we can understand. Now, the actual numbers themselves are pretty small and they're pretty close. But this is kind of what we're doing right now. We're not quite sure how to interpret this too well, but it is interesting to look.
What was that decrease? Is it an alignment?
Well, a decrease is basically how different are your local distributions per point. So the decrease means that they're not too different. So a smaller Earth mover's distance means that they're more aligned, and this spontaneously appears.
Are you saying that, does this mean that these are generative models as well, right?
They don't have to be, they just have to be backwards. They're just,
But some of these are.
yeah.
So are you saying that if we generate an image from one of these models, we can kind of guarantee some bounds on the physical properties it will generate?
I wouldn't put it that strongly, but probably, I mean, I would support it, but I wouldn't put it that strongly because caveat is that we're just using pre-trained models. And of course, we haven't done a full search over all our models to see if this trend holds. But if it does, the implication is that there is zero-shot generalization. So what is interesting is that this specific plot where your Earth mover's distance decreases has actually been observed in astronomical foundation models, so specifically in AstroPT. What we've shown, or we've discovered, I guess, is that we also see this trend to some extent in models that have never seen astro data before. So they exhibit the same convergence behavior as domain-specific models. They're not quite as strongly. So this kind of suggests that scaling improves the model's ability to capture your physical invariance independent of the specific training domain. But again, I do want to emphasize that the actual value here is quite small, or the actual change in the value is quite small. So these aren't strong statements, these are a little speculative. So what are the future, what does possible future work? So a couple of things is that current losses in contrastive models align local pairs but destroy the global topology, and they don't even align local pairs that well. So one proposal is that you can integrate some geometric regularizers during pre-training to full force global manifold preservation, but that requires actually doing the pre-training. The second thing is that you can also do physics-aware pre-training, which basically means using physical metadata as conditioning tokens during pre-training, which will close this so-called modality gap faster than just scaling. And also we need to think about how to address signal dilution. So we kind of need adaptive pooling mechanisms rather than simple mean pooling to extract these physical parameters from giant models. So what is the conclusion? The good is that zero-shot physics, again, take that with an asterisk, that general purpose vision models are trying to minimize or spontaneously minimize on their own the Earth mover's distance to astrophysical parameters without ever having seen the data. And the implication is that your Platonic representation is probably universal. Neural network interacting with natural images learns invariants which are applicable to galaxies. But the bad is that all of this fails when you have multimodal models, unless you're doing it with PalyYAML, which is a special case. Vision language alignment. So your language anchor really forces the embedding space into a structure that's, or that's probably orthogonal to the actual physical manifold. So what do you want to take away from this? Pure vision models are you can utilize scale to learn your physical laws or at least parameters for free, even without domain-specific training. But to what extent, that's unknown. If you want to align different modalities together, this probably breaks the physical precision. At least in language, the discrete nature of language distorts your geometry. And then contrastive learning architectures and objectives are seemingly unreliable. So future architectures must explicitly enforce some sort of topological consistency to prevent your architectures from destroying your physical grounding. Now, so again, like I said, work in progress. Looking for collaborators. Mike isn't here. If you're interested, please talk to Mike. And all of our code and metrics and every analysis is open source. So please look this up on GitHub if you're interested under the name Platonic Universe. That's the end of my talk, I think. I do take questions.
Thank you. That was very interesting. Do we have questions? Yes.
A couple of slides ago where you were showing how, yeah, here. So these decrease as you make your models larger. That makes sense. That's great. But I'm trying to get a sense of what the numbers actually mean. So how good is
The specific
how is it
index.
create our mag?
So 0.38 is actually the best, or 0.36, I guess. The Westerstein or the Earth mover's distance specifically measures the KL divergence. So it has some implicit assumption that your distributions are Gaussian. And that is actually correct, that we're not guaranteed that if you take only a few nearest neighbors, the distributions will look Gaussian. But that's kind of something you have to live with, because if you try to compute the Earth mover's distance in another way, then it leads to all sorts of problems and ML theory that we're not quite sure how to handle. Then of course, the takeaway from this is that it's good at predicting the magnitude and stellar mass. One interesting work I will point you to is that there is a paper called Sparse Feature Nets by John F., who was also one of the co-authors here, where he does some work on predicting physical parameters directly from images, and shows that galaxy images are a fairly good predictor of metallicity, and this spontaneously arises from neural networks. And if I had to point out which person influenced what, it would be kind of obvious. Or it would be kind of interesting, not obvious, I guess.
So is there more? So I remember when I first read the Platonic Representation Hypothesis, like it felt very local. So the CKA approach, I know it's been used to compare other models between each other. Do you have any more thoughts or any other related works that compare the global topology with the local topology?
So there are hundreds. The PRH is just the latest in a long line of works that do this. One I would point you to is called the Indra Representation Hypothesis, which direct ripoff of Platonic, where they do a different metric, I believe. And one interesting thing that you may want to look at is this field originally started when people tried to do robots with AI, because robots had to interact with different modalities all at once. So a lot of this field is actually based on robotics and robotic learning. I point you to some specific papers, but I don't quite remember their names off the top of my head, but I can look them up. But the takeaway is that tons of metrics. We only use 2 or 3 here. Each metric has a lot of arguments in the literature about what metric to use for what situation, which nobody has really resolved. And that's kind of where we're at.
You have a question online?
Go for it.
Go. You want to unmute yourself and ask your
hi.
question?
Yes, so really nice. And then I didn't quite get what you said about like if we do EU maps or like PCA, we just break down the representation convergence. I mean, it was a bit confusing. Can you please come back?
Yeah, you mean this, right? Or this kind of.
Yes,
So yeah. Okay, so
because later you
basically,
come back and say that if you do in clip 2D, you do this 2D representation. Then I was wondering, so there is that possible, or what do you mean?
I think it cut out for what was the exact question?
Yeah,
Can
I
you
mean,
repeat it?
oh yes, of course. You said that you can break the representation convergence if you do a UMAP or PCA over here, right?
So that's not quite what I said. I said
Yes,
that,
sorry.
yeah, so I said that if you construct these image matrices or these embedding matrices, for example, your UMAP or PCA, when you actually visualize the embedding spaces, that visualization changes if you shuffle one of the matrices columns. So what you're doing when you construct these matrices is actually constructing an aligned embedding or two embedding matrices that are aligned column-wise or row-wise, however you choose to do it.
Okay, now I got it. Thank you. Yes, yes.
I have one final quick question, I think, yeah, but one question I had is, you said if you embed something with a big foundation model like an image, then you can see that even if you pre-train on things that is not pre-trained on astronomical data, you get some fair correlation with physical parameters.
Yeah.
But that correlation is broken when you do it with something that's been trained with a contrastive learning with text, and that's because somehow the sort of language anchors the representations to something that is not necessarily physical. What happens if you do a contrastive learning not with text, but between modalities? For example, AstroClip does images as spectra. I would expect maybe because spectra has more, in a way, it has more physical information about certain aspects of the galaxies. I would expect that to sort of increase the alignment of the image representations with physics. Is this really something about contrastive learning, or is this something about what is it that you're aligning with in contrastive learning?
So my answer might be you might think of it as me calling these people out, but we're addressing that with the Aeon Foundation model. But the problem is that only Aeon base has been released. We don't have the other sizes of Aeon. So we can directly, once we have access to the other sizes of Aeon, we can directly test this. Because that's what we suspect as well, is that something in text is causing it to go wrong. Unfortunately, a lot of your foundation models are just text-based.
Rocco wants to follow up. Sorry, that's another question. So, were you about to ask a question?
No, go ahead, I don't maybe.
So I think I need to word it best. If you can go.
Yeah, I'm also a bit not sure what I'm trying to, but I'm interested in this division. This division, right? Why? So you're saying image correlates better with physical features?
Yeah.
Oh, does that mean that a language model cannot understand physics? Are we saying that?
That's a loaded question. Personal opinion is no. I don't think they can understand because in the original PRH, so this sounds a little weird, but in the original PRH paper, they asked this question that, for example, how can an AI model understand the experience of watching a solar eclipse if you just give it the text, I watched a solar eclipse? So if you give your AI model a bunch of mathematical or physical training data points, I guess just text of physics, like solve problems in physics or something, I still don't think it can. But it is kind of hard to quantify, and people are actively working on this. They're trying to make all sorts of AI scientists that understand this.
Because there's also the issue that if you give it images that look alike, yes, I can believe that they're going to be closer. If these are real simulated or observed images, they're gonna be close by in the feature space.
Yeah.
Now you can generate an image that looks very similar to one of these with being non-physical. If this model, I bet, would put it closer to what it looks like in the projection of the image based on pixel brightness. And so I find there's a degeneracy there. There's maybe could be misleading to interpret it that way, but I'm not sure.
No, I think you're right. The simple thing is that we haven't tried it yet. So roughly, I think past this, a lot of it is of the global alignment. Roughly past this, a lot of it is really speculative because we're just trying different things out. And we're also waiting on, as I said, for example, Aeon to release like their bigger models, so we can actually do more comparisons. And then we can start trying to think about feeding in generated data, because there's tools to like make generate data really efficiently as well. So I think eventually we will go in that direction.
Lastly, I think I could also imagine that things that an image gives you separation in feature, depending on the features you chose. Let's say you choose mass. Maybe two phenomena that are very similar but different mass are separated in the image space. But in the text space, it could be a higher level where you're saying all galaxies are fundamentally the same process, and it's going to separate along a different axis than features, right? Maybe it will separate in, okay, this is an exoplanet transit, and this is a galaxy, and I don't care about what mass it has. I'm separating them more in a symbolic way. Could that be a case too?
So are you familiar with AstroLava?
Yes.
I think AstroLava
Mike gave a talk about that in the series.
Oh, lava.
He mentioned it.
He mentioned lava.
Yeah, but
I think lava, and especially what they're doing now, the lava V2 does actually address that more. So talk to them. I don't know too much about lava.
okay.
All right, well,
I will do a story on the chat.
So you have 1 minute.
Sorry.
So I wanted to hear if you have any thoughts on the impact of which depth of layer you're using, because I know in the only image case, I know that early layers usually contain like visual information, like tennis balls and lemons are similar, and deeper ones have like more semantic information. So maybe, yeah.
So this is something that I specifically have been procrastinating a little on, because we are trying to look at all these trends across different layers. You're correct about images that their first few layers are, you can swap them in from any other model and they'll work more or less the same. What we can say so far is just what I said about the multimodal stuff, is that extracting, for example, from just the vision part of a contrastively trained model, sometimes really shows this trend, sometimes doesn't. For SIGLIP and small VLM, it doesn't. For Polygamma, it does. But there is definitely some investigations that we have to do into which layer we're extracting from. Right, so one thing I do want to mention is that all of these, or most of these, but definitely all of these were all extracted from the last layer of every model. Because at that point, you're kind of assuming that they've learned all the best features for a particular task. And it's in some sense, it does make sense to extract from the last layer, because you're guaranteed at that point that the features are the best for segmentation or video understanding or whatever in VJEPA, or convolution, or like I think Convenext was trained for classification initially, so things like that. But something to be missed.
I'm afraid we're out of time, so let's thank Kshitij again for next step. Around this afternoon, indeed, 4:12, if anyone wants to touch base. There's no talk next week because there's a holiday. So see you in 2 weeks. Thank you. Thank you.